Okay, everyone, I think we're gonna get started. So if I could just, hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Think and Drink. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Caroline Deemer. I am the programming coordinator here at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, and I'm very excited to see you all here for Think and Drink. Thursday Think and Drink, for those who don't know, is a free monthly speaker series that happens on the first Thursday evening of every month. This year our theme is Great Women of the Great Lakes and Beyond. And I think that the topic of today, Georgia Green Stebbins, is definitely a great woman of the Great Lakes. So before I let Ken and Barb take it away, first off, if you guys have your phones with you or anything like that, please just remember to put it on silent, just so that we can enjoy the presentation. Second one is, if you guys do enjoy these programs, enjoy these talks, want to see them to continue, please consider becoming a member or donating to the museum. We really appreciate all the support because it helps us keep these going. So with that, I am going to pass it off to Ken and Barb.
Okay.
Wow.
Wow. Hello, everyone. Wow.
This is fabulous. I think as Caroline mentioned, great ladies of the Great Lakes, I think Georgia Green Stebbins certainly fills that bill. Barb and I will try to do justice to a lady that we learned about a few years ago when we wrote a book on the lighthouse that she tended. Once we learned of her, we were compelled to learn more. And we're going to share some of that research with you this evening. Let's see if this behaves itself. It's not moving. Well, let's try that one. No, it's not advancing.
Okay, you might have to click it each time. Yeah.
Great. Up at the front here are the books that Barb and I have written in addition to a business card. You can text us, call us, email us, look at our website. You can look at Facebook. Barb takes care of our Facebook page. If there's anything tonight that we don't cover, if you have questions later on, please feel free to contact us. We've already mentioned this. That's usually for me because I'm terrible at remembering that. There we go. This program and our books would not have been possible without so much help from so many people, especially the folks at North Point Lighthouse in Milwaukee. The gentleman on your far left is John Enright. He fed us bits and pieces of information about Georgia and photographs. He was invaluable. If you get a chance to go down to Milwaukee, the North Point Lighthouse is open on weekends. Highly recommended. It's a wonderful, wonderful renovation. Gentleman in the upper right is the great-grandson of Georgia Stebbins. This is Colonel Buzz Stebbins III. He and his family, most of the archival pictures of Georgia are courtesy of that family. Many of you know research, lighthouse research.
Yeah.
We used our spare bedroom for a lot of this. Barb was not happy with what you see in these photographs. It's not pretty. It's a lot of digging, a lot of work, but we learned an awful lot of things along the way. Many sources were used to produce this program. You know, back in the day, of course, newspapers of that era, books, photographs, artist renditions, and of course nowadays, the internet.
Don't believe everything you read on the internet. It's not always correct. These are the 4 books that Ken and I wrote, and the only thing I will tell you tonight is we have them all available for sale or just for your perusing. And our talk tonight is based on the North Point Milwaukee Lighthouse book that keys into Georgia, and the Wisconsin Lighthouse book that covers all the lights in the state. That's the end of the sales pitch. One of our key resources for this program was Georgia's scrapbook. It's over 100 years old and it contains more than 100 pages. And some of the pages are in great shape and some were in terrible shape. But there were enough pages that you could read all of her quotes. So we'll be sharing some of her words with you tonight, which we find fascinating. And today her scrapbook rests at the museum at the North Point Lighthouse in Milwaukee under glass, but you can actually see it. This is the Lady of the Lighthouse. This is Georgia Anna Green Stebbins. She was a wife, mother, sister, friend, grandmother, and an exemplary lighthouse keeper. In the late 1800s, only 10% of the workforce in the U.S. were women. Lighthouse keepers were predominantly men. It was uncommon for women to have that role. Usually the wife might have been the assistant, probably just not even a title position. She just needed to help her husband. On Lake Michigan now, there were about 1,200 keepers, and only 4% of those were women keepers. So Georgia was a one-of-a-kind woman. Georgia's name, oh boy. So again, just like the focal point of a lighthouse, what was her name? We called her Georgia Anna Green. She's Miss Georgiana, she's Georgiana, and she's Mrs. George. That's my personal favorite. Mrs. George.
Let's go back a long time ago. Georgia Green was born in 1846. We want to give you a flavor that the times back then were certainly vastly different than today. There were only 29 states in the U.S. at that time, and there were significant world and USA events going on in that era as well. I won't read them all, but it gives you a sense of what we're going to talk about of the era that she grew up in is vastly different, thankfully, than some of the things we do. Thankfully, things today are vastly different, is what I meant to say.
Got it.
You've probably heard of some of these special events, special people. Abraham Lincoln was just elected to Congress in 1846. Yeah. Why did we put this slide in here? Kerosene was invented the year Georgia was born. Kerosene became the predominant liquid fuel of the era when Georgia was a lighthouse keeper. We'll touch on that in a little bit again. The Civil War was still in the future, and Buffalo Bill Cody was born. Ladies in the audience, we have a predominant female audience tonight. In 1846, the right to vote for women in the U.S. was 74 years away. In 1920, Georgia she passed away in 1921. Remember this slide.
Milwaukee was incorporated as a city very early on and became known as the Cream City. Most of you have heard of Milwaukee Cream City brick, a very durable building material. Many lighthouses were built of this, and there's tons of buildings in Milwaukee and all over the southeastern part of the state built of Milwaukee Cream City brick. It's really pretty. And the first lighthouse was already 8 years old in Milwaukee when Georgia was born. This sat at the end of what was called Grand Avenue. Today it's Wisconsin Avenue. Ah, beer. Oh, yes.
Milwaukee.
Think and drink. Okay. Small Milwaukee breweries were beginning at this time, but then all of a sudden, lots of big names here that you folks will recognize. And some of the breweries exist and some no longer are with us. This next slide is one of my favorites. The prices, yes, the prices and wages in 1846. I'm a scratch baker, so I love the price of flour and sugar and butter. And the very last one listed is the keeper's yearly income, $500 a year, which seems paltry, but they were provided with a nice home provided by the government that they had to take good care of. And they were given staples such as flour and sugar. Most of them could keep a vegetable garden. Some of them had chickens or pigs. It was a good life as far as that goes. Oh, I'm supposed to mention the wine and the beer too. Okay, there I did.
Think and drink.
Think and drink.
One little tidbit about the last number, as Barb mentioned, it was 24 cents an hour if they worked 40 hours. They worked a lot more than that. Georgia Green was born again in 1846 in a small town in upstate New York called Jordan. It was a little bit west of Syracuse. We're going to briefly talk about some of the cities that early in Georgia's life, she and ultimately her husband lived. There were three main towns in the first few decades of her life. Georgia was a small rural village. Estimated population at that time was about 1,000. It was in scenic upstate New York along the route of the original Erie Canal. Why is that important? It eventually connected the Great Lakes, the state of New York City, and the Atlantic Ocean. Georgia had a connection to the Great Lakes when she was born that she didn't even realize. The canal was opened in 1825, and again, it eventually connected the Great Lakes on the west to New York and the Atlantic Ocean. This is from the 1850 census. Georgia would just have been a few years of age. It was common, of course, back in that time, families were pretty large. There were 6 children in her family. Georgia is the youngest.
So here are some of these great photos provided to us by Buzz Stebbins. The first photo, he estimated Georgia to be about 10 years old. And the next one, he thought as an early teenager. And I just love the ringlets in her hair. Isn't that fabulous? And how long it would have taken her to do that. The next photo shows her husband-to-be. This is Lemuel Stebbins. He's 19 years old in this picture, and he looks quite dashing. No wonder she chose him. He's born in Bethel, Connecticut, and he's 5 years older than Georgia. Bethel is another small rural town. Their claim to fame was hat and shoemaking. Why not? The Green and Stebbins family, though, can trace their ancestry back to Great Britain as far back as the mid-1700s. So I think that's a pretty amazing fact. But nothing is known of the courtship of Georgia and Lemuel. They were married in her hometown of Jordan, New York in 1866. Georgia is 20 years old on her wedding day. This photo was taken shortly before her wedding, we're told. And the next slide shows the church. This is the Christ Episcopal Church in Jordan, and the church still stands today.
The wedding announcement is on the left, and 9 months and 2 days after their marriage, their first child was born. Everybody always gets that one. Sadly, the arrow points, in addition to the notification in the church about their wedding, Georgia had 2 young girls within a year apart. Both of them unfortunately passed away. That was quite common. We'll talk about that in a second. But her second daughter, Emma, a little blurb there from the newspaper was in Georgia's scrapbook.
Yeah.
Neither of her children lived more than 3 months. But again, back in that time frame, 1/3 of the kids born in the United States did not reach age 5, primarily from diseases that today we no longer have to worry about. Even though that was common, it certainly must have been difficult for both Georgia and Lemuel. On a happier note, this was in Georgia's scrapbook. We do not know if it is her writing, but it's a poem that's written about 2 youngsters that passed away in a faraway place and are buried near a tree in a cemetery, much like the photograph we saw previously. We can't know for certain that Georgia wrote this, but I wouldn't be surprised. It would be 6 more years before Georgia had a child, a son. At some point, Lemuel and Georgia moved to New York City. He was a jeweler and a watchmaker, so we surmise it's probably related to his work. This is about 1870. This is Lemuel, a little bit older, and an artist's rendition of a jeweler during that era. Back in that time, New York City was a terrible place for air quality. There was smog. It wasn't a nice place. Georgia develops a persistent hacking cough and tiredness that will not go away. She goes to the doctor and she's diagnosed with what at the time is called consumption. We know it today as tuberculosis. This is many times a fatal illness. Doctor said, you should go somewhere with fresh air, fresh lake breezes. They say this is the turning point of her life. If she had not gotten sick, if this had not happened, the rest of this story probably would not have occurred. There you go.
So the doctors say, you have to get out of New York City. She gets a letter from her parents, who are the caretakers of the original North Point Lighthouse, built in 1855. And her mother says, your father's health isn't good. Maybe you could come here and you could help for a while, because the fresh lake breezes are coming right off of Lake Michigan. So sure enough, she goes 900 miles to the west. How did she get there? We're not sure. She could have taken a train. She could have taken a passenger steamer. Don't forget about the Erie Canal. We're just not sure. We'd love to know. This is Georgia's father, Daniel Kellogg Green, known as D.K. Green. And he was the first chief lighthouse keeper at the Milwaukee North Point Lighthouse. We have no photos of her mother, Catherine, unfortunately. And by the time Georgia gets to Milwaukee, her mother's health is declining. So immediately she starts to help with lighthouse chores. These maps show you the bump that's called Milwaukee North Point. And the next picture is an artist's rendering of what the harbor would have looked like back in the day, with all of the schooners coming and going. And the arrow shows you where the North Point Lighthouse would have been. It was a very popular lighthouse, apparently, for artists. Harper's Magazine featured it. And a friend of ours by the name of Brooks penned this sketch one night at a dinner party on the back of a cocktail napkin. He's an artist, so we kept that napkin. Yes, we did. And this is the only known photo of the original 1855 Milwaukee North Point Lighthouse when it was in use. It seems to be a little too close to the bluff, but we'll get into that. We couldn't find any photos of the inside. They didn't take a lot of photos back at that time either. Film was precious, and why would you take a picture inside your house? Nobody wants to see your kitchen. So we determined just from history that it was a very basic home, but it was a very nice home. And of course, a wood burning stove, small bed, very nice home. There she is.
This is the first known photo of Georgia. The back of the photo says that it was taken in Milwaukee. This is the late 1870s, and Georgia would be around in her early 30s. The federal government was in charge of most lighthouses. They had rules, they had instructions. This was called like the Bible of instructions for lighthouse keepers. So Georgia would have used that in addition to the information she would have gleaned from her father. There are dozens and dozens of lighthouse duties outlined in this book. Most of them are featured in this slide. Most of them have to do with obviously keeping the lamp lit at dusk through dawn. There were other chores, of course, daily cleaning. Later on, Georgia has a family, and a 3-generational family at the lighthouse. So in addition to lighthouse duties, she's doing a lot of family interactions and duties as well. I mentioned in 1846, when Georgia was born, that kerosene was invented. This was a very useful liquid lighthouse fuel back in that era. So she would have been using this very flammable material. Some of the instruments she would have gone up to the light with, smaller containers to fill the lamp, larger containers to pour out of there. And of course, there was no electricity, and she would have had the lantern as well. On the far left photo, she would have put the kerosene oil in the base of that lamp. Fresnel lenses were in use at that time. What they are a series of dozens of hand-polished glass prisms in this brass beehive type arrangement. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know how they work. The light in the middle of the lens projects these light rays in all kinds of directions. The glass prisms from the lens bend it and magnify it and send it out to mariners on whatever body of water you're on. Fresnel lenses revolutionized lighthouses throughout the world. They could be seen much farther and they were much brighter. This is an artist rendering. We call her Miss Georgia. She was a married lady, but this is Miss Georgia tending her light. Georgia, very quickly, her health began to improve. Obviously, she was very busy with family as well as lighthouse chores. Lighthouse keeping agreed with her, and thankfully her health improved.
Another very important duty that lighthouse keepers had to take care of was the daily logbook. And there's a rule that says no entry shall be made by anyone other than the keepers of that light station. It's a rule. So she would have had a desk where she could write in her logbook every day. And I like to think of her sitting at a desk writing letters or cards to friends and family to keep in touch. In addition to keeping the lighthouse, her son Albert was born, yay, in 1875. George is about 30 years old at the time of Albert's birth. And of course, he was the apple of her eye. So in her scrapbook are lots of things that relate to Albert. Just little newspaper clippings or a small portrait. He was such a cute little boy. She kept everything in that scrapbook, which is fantastic. So we have his grade school report card, and notice she signed off on it as Mrs. L.D. Stebbins. Okay, not George and Mrs. Lemuel Stebbins. Okay, good enough. Apparently he got good grades in grade school. This photo is from the late 1800s. Albert is in his early teens, and we estimate Georgia to be about 40. She kept his high school report cards as well, and my mother threw everything out, so this is just amazing to me that anybody would have, what's all this junk? It was all gone. But she kept everything. She even has his commencement card from high school, which is fantastic. Here's Albert as an adult. He became a prominent Milwaukee attorney, and he looks very formidable, so I want him to be on my side. Scare the dickens out of me.
Aside from her son Albert, Georgia's life is punctuated with important family events in addition, of course, to her lighthouse duties. 1881 was a very important year in Georgia's life. She finally became the official, recognized by the federal government, head lighthouse keeper at North Point. She had been there at least, in that capacity, at least 5 or more years. The government still recognized her father as the lighthouse keeper. Obviously, they finally figured out Georgia's running the show. She should be recognized as such. Unfortunately, that same year, Georgia's mother, Catherine, passes away. So she's juggling a lot of things. A few years later, around 1885, these photographs show a very significant erosion problem at the first light. I mean significant. The government was very slow to react. Several decades, actually, it took them before they built a second light farther inland. But Georgia kept this newspaper clipping that says the lighthouse is going to fall literally if something isn't done or a new light is built. So she would have been intimately involved with the construction people with the second North Point light and eventually the demolition of the first light. During this time in 1887, Georgia's father also passes away and her sister Emma passes away. Again, just think back at that era. You're juggling tremendous amounts of lighthouse work as well as family. This is a sketch and a letter that George is writing between the federal government as this new lighthouse was going to be built several hundred feet farther inland at North Point.
Georgia's simple logbook entry when the lamp is first lighted in the new lighthouse. This is January 10th, 1888. Bernard Lynn's to new tower. Lamp lighted there. 20 degrees below zero overnight.
Real winter.
So they would have had probably a pot-bellied stove in the tower, but still, it's not going to keep you very warm. But this is the original 4th order Fresnel lens that still lives at the North Point Lighthouse today. It's in a lovely exhibit in their museum, so you can walk right up to it and get a real good look at it. It's, as Ken mentioned, a beautiful piece of work, and we didn't talk about the North Point light was a revolving light, so it would have a clockwork mechanism. There's something that looks like a big hollow tube with a door, and that's where the weights would have gone. So it's wound like a cuckoo clock. So she's doing that several times a night in addition to whatever else she's doing. And I'm going to read a quote. This is Miss George's night at the lighthouse. At sunset, I carry a lamp up. It weighs 25 pounds with the oil. That burns until midnight. Then I carry up the second one, which lasts until dawn. I don't get to sleep until after my midnight visit to the tower, and then I sleep until 4 a.m. In the summer, it's almost dawn, so I stay up. I make up for my lost sleep by a noon nap. Wow. Wow.
This is how the second light at North Point would have looked shortly after 1888 when it was built. Again, by today's standards, it's very basic, but actually for that time, it was very nice. Much better than the first lighthouse certainly was. Some of the modern comforts that we take for granted today, again, did not exist. Electricity, indoor plumbing, hot water. Sometimes the lighthouse era of the 1850s to early 1900s is looked upon as this just grand, idyllic time. It was work upon work upon work.
Not at all.
The new tower has 42 steps, and up along the way, there's several portholes that Georgia would have been able to look out over Lake Michigan to see what was going on. We're gonna briefly take a trip up there we go. Take a trip up the stairs with Georgia. Remember, she has a long dress on. She's carrying a fairly large container of fuel, a lantern to light the way. We wonder if she was able to hold on to the railings. She did it many times. Disregard any plastic chairs you see in this video. Barb and I have climbed this tower, and we look out the portholes, and you just get a sense of you're standing where a very important lady went up and down so many times. At the very top of the tower, underneath the base of where the lamp is this.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
13 steps, not quite vertical, but darn close. How she got up there with the fuel, perhaps she made trips back and forth on the ladder, but I can't imagine with the clothing of that era how she did it, but obviously she did it many times. Bet you didn't know there was going to be math. It always intrigued us. Her tenure was over 30 years. She went up and down the tower several times a night. So conservatively, we looked at some numbers of how many steps, how many trips she would have taken in her tenure. Over 1,000 trips each year. In her career, 33,000 trips. We added the steps in, whatever I said, 42, I think. For her career, she went up and down almost 1.5 million stairs, and that doesn't include going down. Nobody needed to go to a gym back then. These people were hard workers.
Here's a quote from a newspaper in 1906. Here's Georgia. I have my room where I can look out at the light. The light actually suits me to sleep. For years, I slept with its glare full in my face, and I supposed then that I could not rest comfortably any other way. I could not sleep at all if I could not see the light. And you can see where her bedroom would have been, and she could easily see the light full in her face. Let's talk about a lighthouse keeper's pay.
Is my favorite.
$500 a year, $520 a year, still considered a good job. She's been keeper about 16 years at this point, and some research that we came upon was she earns still just a little bit less than men lighthouse keepers. Boo.
Boo.
Boo. Speaking of pay, who was the breadwinner in the family? We're not really sure. Lemuel was a jeweler by trade, but her job was considered an excellent job and very prestigious. So we're not really sure. We can't tell you that one for sure. This is Lemuel a few years later and his listing in the Milwaukee City Directory in 1885. His business was on Wisconsin Avenue in downtown Milwaukee. Wish there was a photo of that jewelry store, but there is not. And other things that happened at the lighthouse, Georgia and her family had a huge bull mastiff dog named Taffin. Some of her personal papers indicate she was glad to have the dog. She was home alone during the day at the lighthouse. And it's not like it is today. You park your car, you walk 5 minutes, and you're there. She was very isolated. So she said she did appreciate having the big dog. Didn't indicate if she ever had to sig him on anybody, but it was a good thing. And Tappan was a bit of a celebrity in his own right. So of course she saved any newspaper clippings about her beloved Tappan.
In 1892 in Milwaukee, the politicians in Milwaukee decided to do a lot of setting aside of land for parks. Lake Park sprang up that year. The gentleman here is Frederick Law Olmsted. If you've ever heard of him, chances are you know he's a prominent landscape architect in the U.S., famous for designing New York's Central Park as well as several other parks in Milwaukee. So he and his firm would have been involved with what was going to happen at Milwaukee North Point, the Lighthouse, as well as the park. These are some of the early photos of Lake Park in that era. Olmsted took the lighthouse as one of the prominent focal points in that park. Bottom left, if you've ever been to the Lion Bridges in Milwaukee's Lake Park, it's a beautiful scenery with a taller light than you see there. Once the renovation of the park was done, the government realized that the Lighthouse Keeper's house faced the wrong way. So they altered it to face Lake Michigan, the prominent part of Mr. Olmsted's plan. So Georgia, of course, being the head keeper, would have been highly involved with that adventure, and it must have been.
Must have been an adventure. She was one busy lady for sure. Also in 1897, George's son Albert marries Anna Camper Wintemore. They lived at North Point Lighthouse, and the newspaper clipping lists all the wedding guests.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that fabulous, right?
And none of the ladies were identified by their first
That
names.
was like
None of them.
Mrs. John or all of that. We know how that goes. The family was very well respected in the community, and there's even a poem that Anna wrote called Women of America that was published in the newspaper. So of course Georgia would have kept that as well. Anna has two children at the North Point Lighthouse. These are Georgia's grandsons. Roland is born in 1898 and Albert II in 1899. Albert becomes a Marine in his later years, and Roland becomes a lawyer, just like his father. Georgia adored her grandchildren. This is an old census from 1900. It indicates a 3-generational family at North Point. During this time, they had a servant. We did some research. She was called a servant, but she was paid. She did some nanny duties, of course, cleaning. I think she was actually Georgia's right hand, and whatever needed to be done on any given day, Carrie Newhouse did it. Most of the love book entries you would read are boring. You know, a ship passed, or I painted today, I cleaned. Okay. On this particular year, though, in 1892, the ships Snowdrop and Elma were both wrecked off of North Point. So, of course, that would have made the newspaper. And there was also an accident with a sailboat getting caught in a storm. This article actually talks about Georgia rescuing 3 men. Good for her. Yeah.
One other very special event occurred off of North Point in 1893 that Georgia happened to be in the tower and was a witness to. There was a storm brewing out on the lake. This is called the Milwaukee Crib disaster. It was in all the papers of the day. The city was enlarging their water intake in Lake Michigan and building a new pipeline and structure. Men were in a chamber below lake level, this structure above lake level. The storm just blew it away. She happened to be looking out at the lake at that time. Newspaper accounts differ on exactly where she went, and we don't know for certain. Milwaukee North Point Lighthouse eventually got a phone. We're not sure if it wasn't working or if they didn't have one yet. One account said she went down the street to a local saloon to use the phone. She was going to call the life-saving service in the harbor of Milwaukee. Another account has her going in the neighborhood. There was a facility called the Milwaukee Protestant Home. So she called the lakefront. This is a couple of miles south of North Point. Raging storm. Imagine what the men from the life-saving station had to do. 15 men were trapped in the chamber below lake level. The gentleman here is Ingar Olsen. He got a special commendation for his bravery. They saved one individual. We could find nothing in the local papers that mentioned Georgia seeing this and contacting them. If any of you ever were in Milwaukee in the 50s and 60s, 1960s, excuse me, this was called the Love Rock. This is the intake that we were just talking about with the crib disaster. Eventually it was demolished. They had more modern intakes out in the lake.
There's lots of other information that we could learn from Georgia's logbooks as well as her scrapbook. Here's an entry from January 28th of 1888. Total eclipse of the moon. Clear, beautiful night. And she saved other articles about astronomy. And she had a lot of other interests. She loved gardening. And we're told her particular flower favorite was petunias. And some of her personal letters state how upset she was when visitors came and either picked or trampled her flowers. The nerve, come on, poor thing. So here, August of 1895, here's a fun little logbook entry. The commons connecting the lighthouse set on fire. Department here, no serious damage, lively time. But her letter to the lighthouse inspector is much more detailed about what actually happened.
Georgia's scrapbook, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was just this treasure trove of information.
Yeah.
Some of it was very tiny, others much more elaborate, especially with her son Albert. In addition to the flowers that Barb mentioned, she had things in here about roses, other recipes, especially she must have liked soups. There's a Christmas card in the middle from 1885 that still is in really nice condition. There was another famous woman lighthouse keeper on Lake Michigan, in very southern Lake Michigan, Harriet Colfax. The two clippings on the right were in Georgia's scrapbook, so she was certainly aware of this woman. I don't think anybody was aware that ultimately Georgia would be equally famous, if you will. Also in here is a poem from Susan B. Anthony, a lady at the time that was pressing for rights for more women in the United States. Georgia was certainly not alone. Georgia was very modest, though. She kept these clippings, and they're very useful to researchers like Barb and I. In the newspaper, she was quite a bit, but she didn't ever think of herself in any kind of celebrity role. But I think the Milwaukee media at that time thought that's what she was. Early in the 1900s, the federal government wanted to improve the Milwaukee harbor. This would be the beginning of the end of the Milwaukee North Point Light. It took them a long time to do that, though. They were petitioning to get improved lights in the harbor. North Point was farther to the north, and they deemed it possibly not necessary. Many signatures were procured from citizens that thought that was not a good idea.
Unfortunately, these events eventually led to Georgia's retirement. Here's a long quote from Georgia. I have been away from the lighthouse hardly a dozen nights since I first took charge. Naturally, I have become very much attached to the lighthouse, having lived here so long. And I think that there is no more beautiful spot on the lakeshore. I have my husband, my son, and his two little boys here. I hope I shall stay here with them all until the end. So her time was drawing to a close at North Point, and she's a government employee, so you do as you're told. Here's one of her logbook writings, Wednesday, June 19th, 1907. Wind easterly, light, cloudy. Order received for discontinuance of the light, June 30th. Her final entry on June 30th was modest as well. Wind southwest at times fresh, PM showers. Light discontinued this 30th day of June, 1907. Correct statement, Georgia A. Stebbins, keeper.
How old was she at that time?
She would have been 60.
61. So the lighthouse was decommissioned for 2 years. Guess what? They changed their minds. Surprise! So we know very little of Georgia's retirement years either. She lived on Milwaukee's east side in several different locations, again, still with 3 generations of family. And Lemuel still maintained his watchmaker and jewelry store in downtown Milwaukee.
When you think as a researcher, you know all of the story, every once in a while you come upon a new piece of information. Just earlier this year, somebody put us onto this particular letter that was in the National Archives. It's a government letter responding to a letter from Georgia petitioning to be reinstated as the Lighthouse Keeper. They told her the lighthouse was going to be decommissioned. They changed their mind in a couple of years, and Georgia wanted her job back. We don't know the circumstances of that process, but she was not reinstated. So the government continued to have this light at Milwaukee North Point with a different keeper. The ghost lighthouse in the middle, if you will, was put there temporarily. I think we lost Caroline's on it though. Testing, good? Good?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Trees were growing up in Lake Park. Mariners were complaining out on Lake Michigan that they could not see Milwaukee North Point as well as they used to. So this temporary tower in the middle was built, and eventually in 1912, a larger lighthouse came to be. A new base was put on the bottom. You can see the seam where Georgia's lighthouse is on the top. This is in Milwaukee's Lake Park. Love the old cars. Milwaukee North Point today, this is the lighthouse that exists today, is still one of the tallest lights above lake level because it sits on a tall bluff. The height was more than doubled to 74 feet. This document really threw Barb and I for a loop. It's the 1920 census. It speaks of the Stebbins family, a multi-generational family, as Barb mentioned. And it's difficult to read some of this without having it in front of you. Several of the columns ask certain questions about whether you're working, whether you're retired, whether you can speak English, whether a bunch of things. And in Georgia's column, it says she can't speak English. Of course, always be aware of information that may or may not be correct. We think in this case it is correct, but it's correct for a convoluted sort of reason. We obtained Georgia's death certificate. She passed away in 1921. 10 days short of her 75th birthday. Her occupation is listed as housewife. There's no mention that she's a retired lighthouse keeper of almost 30 years. It says the cause of death is senility. Today we would say something along the lines of Alzheimer's or dementia. There's a contributory factor of a brain aneurysm. This slide I showed early on. When she was born in 1846, women's right to vote in the United States was still 74 years away. She lived to be 75. It was ratified by the U.S. put into the Constitution in 1920. Georgia is a federal government employee responsible for the safety of literally hundreds of mariners in her time at Milwaukee North Point. She did not have the right to vote. Boo. Times were different.
Georgia and much of her family are buried in Milwaukee's Forest Home Cemetery. The family plot includes Georgia, her husband, both her parents, her sister Emma, her brother D.K. Green II, and his wife Ella. Many of you know that Forest Home Cemetery is the final resting place for many of Milwaukee's early movers and shakers, the beer barons, and a lot of politicians, It's a great place to go explore. It is. Eventually, the lighthouse was actually decommissioned. They finally did it. Look at it. It looks terrible. This is 1994. It's boarded up. They wanted to turn the grounds into a dog park. They had all kinds of other plans for it. Thankfully, there are some really stubborn people at that time on the east side. In 1996, they formed a group and they were determined to save North Point. We thought it would never happen, but yet in 2007, at the rededication of the North Point Lighthouse, Colonel Albert Buzz Stebbins III, great-grandson of Georgia, is the guest of honor at North Point.
If you go to Milwaukee, North Point today, there are still many remembrances of Georgia. Her original table is called a drop leaf table. It's in the museum. There's also a description of that table, as well as a wall informational poster, if you will, of her life, in particular her tenure at Milwaukee North Point. A couple of years ago, and also this past summer, it's a Milwaukee city park, a county park, still federal government land. They were given permission to do some very minor excavations. They were trying to find the foundation of the original 1855 light. That would have been the light that Georgia first started at with her parents. This was a chance photograph that Barb and I took driving through North Point one day. The storm had just passed, the rainbow came by, and it happened to start at the base of Georgia's lighthouse. Today, we think Georgia would be very pleased. 30 years ago, if you looked at the lighthouse, you'd never think it could come back. It's now considered the jewel of Lake Park. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, as well as the National Register of Historic Lighthouses. Yeah, Georgia would be quite pleased. We're going to finish the program and leave you with some of the images you've already seen of a very young lady, very remarkable for her day. She left New York City as a fairly sick young woman, came to Milwaukee to help her parents, did not know anything about lighthouse keeping, and became the longest serving lighthouse keeper at Milwaukee North Point. She certainly had her share of heartaches along the way, but she was one heck of a lady.
Here's Georgia watching over her light. This is a quote from Georgia. "It seems to me a lighthouse is a commonplace affair, and it seems to me the work of taking care of the light is very ordinary indeed." We disagree. We think she was amazing. Thank you so much for coming today.
Questions, comments? We've got time. In the back there, please.
You said that she was born in New York, and that she moved out there to help her parents, right?
Correct.
Is there any information about how her parents got from New York to being at the lighthouse?
She's asking about the path of Georgia from New York State, New York City to Milwaukee. Her parents obviously were in New York State when she was born in Jordan, New York. We don't have a lot of information on how her parents got to the Midwest. We do have a little bit of information. Her father was a farmer for a brief amount of time. Very little information is known about that, as well as what her mother did. Primarily back then, the ladies were housekeeping, spouses, moms, wives. There's always additional research to try to dig into. And I think we mentioned it during the program too. We're not positive how Georgia also got to Milwaukee. Was it a ship? Was it the railroad? Uncertain. Great question. Way in the back, somebody had a hand up. Yes.
Hi. Did she ever request a transfer instead of a retirement? Other lighthouse keepers, when they were done with the service, would request to be transferred to a different lighthouse afterwards. Did she ever request to be moved, or was she kind of in place as her family?
Gentleman is asking about did Georgia ever request a transfer to a different lighthouse? Because that was quite common that lighthouse keepers would have been at several lights. Occasionally, there would be some stationed at one light for their entire work time. There is no records, no evidence of that at all. Obviously, she had family with her, a lot of family, extended family in the Milwaukee area once she got settled here. It is not uncommon. No, that's probably not the right word. There are examples of some lighthouse keepers at one particular light for several decades. Georgia's tenure is certainly one of the highest at a single lighthouse. Anybody else? Yes.
Was her husband ever in the Civil War? I'm looking at that 6-year gap when she wasn't pregnant.
She's asking if Lemuel was ever in the Civil War. Not that we've ever come across. There's so many missing pieces. We're not really sure.
Again, there's always, our primary focus was Georgia, but obviously her coming to Milwaukee because of her parents and her own ill health are all tied together. Over here, please.
Were her 2 daughters buried with the family?
The question is, where are her 2 daughters buried? They are both buried in Connecticut, in the town that Lemuel was from. The tombstone is their actual tombstone in Bethel, Connecticut. Yes?
How many years then was she a keeper at North Point then?
The question is, how long was Georgia a keeper at North Point? Officially recognized as the head keeper by the federal government, 27 years. If we're not exactly sure the exact year that she came to Milwaukee, probably 35 is probably on the high side. It's certainly more than 30. Unofficially, if you don't count the first several years that the government said, D.K. Green, her father, was the chief keeper, and he'll keep that title until somebody must have realized that she was doing the work, and she had been doing that for several years. So it's 30 plus, which is
Long time.
unbelievable. Anybody else?
Thank you so much.
Caroline, thank you, and thank you. We'll be around if anybody needs some further. Thank you.
Perfect. So yes, thank you so much, Ken and Barb. That was so fun. I learned so much about Georgia, and she's such a cool lady. Thank you again, everyone, for coming out. If you like programs like this, I do have a couple of exciting ones that are coming up. Actually this month on Saturday, November 23rd, we are going to be hosting Lost on the Lakes, Remembering the Ralph Simmons, which is going to be a deep dive into the story of the Ralph Simmons. So into the story of the wreck, the discovery, and now its legacy. So that will be really cool. That's going to be from 5 to 7 p.m. And just like Think and Drinks, it's going to be both free in person, but also streamed online. So if you guys would like to check that out, that will be there. And then next Think and Drink is December 5th. And it is going to be about women in submarines and the history of women in submarines, which is a pretty modern history, but a very impressive one nonetheless. And then I will also just give a plug for the event that is coming up right after that, which is Christmas Tree Ship Day. Christmas Tree Ship Day is our one free day at the museum. So if you want to come into the museum, check out the submarine, and also see Santa come in by tugboat. That's going to be on December 7th from 10 to 4. So lots of fun things going on. And once again, if you guys enjoy these programs, enjoy things like it, please consider donating to the museum, becoming a member, or just letting your friends and family know about these events and keep on showing up. So thank you so much.
It all worked.
Yes. It all worked. Yes.
Yes.